Hebrews 11:7 says a third point. Noah followed God in spite of his failures. Look at verse 7. It says, in reverence he prepared an ark for the salvation of his household. He prepared a what? An ark? They didn't have arks back then. And maybe you'll be the first one building a godly Christian home in your neighborhood. Maybe they've never seen one of those either. But when God calls us to do something, we do it in spite of our failures. You say, what do you mean by that? Well, I'm not going to drag you all over the scriptures, but did you know that Noah had some problems? Most notably, he had a drinking problem. He had, perhaps, we don't know, but it took an awful long time to build that boat. And I don't know if there's a motivation problem. I don't know if anything about it. But all I know is that in spite of... And he also had problems with his kids because he had one son that didn't respond correctly to him. But what I see with Noah is that Noah followed God in spite of his failures, in spite of his weaknesses, in spite of his personal problems. God says in spite of all that, his life was a life of obedience. Now, let me share this with you. I shared this on Wednesday night when we were going through this section, but I can't help but read it again. It's from the authors of that great book, Fearfully and Wonderfully Made, Paul Brand and Phil Yancey. This is what he said. Who could have predicted that God would choose not Esau, the honest, reliable hunter, but Jacob, the trickster, liar, and heel? Who would believe that God would put the finger on Noah, who would hit the bottle? Or on Moses, who was trying to beat the rap in Midian for braining a man in Egypt? And if it weren't for the honor of the things, he'd just as soon as let Aaron go back and face the music with Pharaoh. And what a ragged lot, mad as hatters, all of them. The exception seemed to be the means. The first people God created went out and did the only thing God told them not to do. The one he chose to lead the new nation known as God's people tried to pawn his wife off on an unsuspecting Pharaoh. The wife herself, when told at the ripe old age of 91 that God was going to deliver the son he had promised her, broke into a rasping laughter and laughed into the very face of God. How about Rahab, a harlot, who became revered for her faith? Solomon, the wisest man who ever lived, and yet he went out of his way to break every proverb he so astutely composed. And even after Jesus came, the pattern continued. The two disciples who did the most to spread the word after his departure, John and Peter, were the two he had to rebuke the most for always squabbling and being muddle-headed. How about the Apostle Paul? He wrote more books of the Bible than any other writer. He was selected for the task of doing that great ministry while kicking up dust swirls from town to town, sniffing Christians to torture them. Jesus sure has the nerve. He entrusted the high-minded ideals of love and unity and fellowship of his church to a group like this. No wonder cynics have looked at the church and said, if that group of people is supposed to represent God, I'll vote against him. Or as Nietzsche expressed it, his disciples will have to look more like saved people if I'm going to believe in their Savior. But here's the key. How wonderful that God is more gracious than men. God never excuses our disobedience. God never overlooks our unfaithfulness. He never winks at our sin, but he will forgive every sin that is placed under the atoning death of his Son, Jesus Christ. And Noah built an ark because he found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Look back at Hebrews 11:7. Number 1, Noah stood against the world. He led because he believed in God. Number 2, Noah listened to God when no one else was listening, and he led because he stayed in touch with God. Number 3, Noah followed God in spite of his failures. Noah led because he obeyed God. Number 4, look at this. It says in verse 7, by which he saved his household. The salvation of his household. Here's the 4th point. Noah encouraged his family to follow him. Noah led because he had the respect of his family. You say, what do you mean? Well, do you know what the pressure would be to have a dad that was doing what no one else in the whole world was doing, and to have 3 boys have to choose between the whole world and their dad? Doesn't that sound what parenting's all about? Doesn't that sound like every day? Doesn't that sound like what we're all facing? Noah, contra mundum, against the world, 3 boys, and the whole world out there. And they're torn. Are they going to go this way with the gang, or are they going to go this way with him? Did you know the Bible is replete with dads whose kids didn't follow him? Most notably, look at Lot. Genesis 19 you remember what happened with Lot? God says, I'm going to fire and brimstone this place and destroy it totally. You go back and tell your family, Lot. And Lot went back. And you know what it says that they said? They thought he was drunk and mocking at them. And they stayed in town. His 2 daughters left, but the rest of his family, the sons-in-laws, stayed in town and were destroyed because they didn't follow their father. And what we see is that God says that Noah was a great man because Noah encouraged his family to follow him as he followed God. They went along with the project. Did you know, I say this all the time, but the scriptures say the greatest thing you can do is have your children go with you to heaven. At this conference, the people were talking. They say, what are your goals? What are you going to do? And I said, I have one very simple goal. I hope and pray by God's grace that I take every one of my children with me to heaven, and their wives, and their husbands, and their children, but them. Are your children following you? Are you encouraging your family to follow him? Noah led because he had the respect of his family.